Thomas Paine, from corset maker and tax collector to revolutionary writer with an impact on not one, but two revolutions. Perhaps no man's words had a greater impact on the American Revolution than those of Thomas Paine. Hello, friends, and welcome to the History Revolution podcast. And remember, you can join our newsletter to stay up to date with all the latest episodes, blogs, and specials by going to the link in the description below. Now, let's get started. Thomas Paine was born in Thetford, England, on January 29, 1737, the son of a Quaker father and an Anglican mother. Paine was somewhat educated, but at the age of 13 began apprenticing with his father as a corset maker. That career was never going to do it for Thomas. He tried his hand at several professions, including becoming a crew member on a privateer ship during the 7 Years' War. Paine then became an excise officer or tax collector. It was at this time that he wrote his first pamphlet arguing for a pay raise for excise officers and an end to corruption. He delivered the pamphlets to members of Parliament. He would go on to lose his job, and Paine continued to flounder in England until he was introduced to Benjamin Franklin. Franklin was in London on behalf of the colonies, arguing against the Stamp Act, Townshend Acts, and Intolerable Acts. Upon meeting Thomas Paine, Benjamin Franklin convinced him to move to America to start over. Franklin wrote Paine letters of introduction to help him get started. Thomas Paine arrived in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania on November 30th, 1774. His move to America was not an easy one, as he barely survived the voyage. Bad drinking water on his ship had caused several passengers to die of typhoid. It took Paine 6 weeks to recover from typhoid once he arrived in Philadelphia. Paine arrived in Philadelphia penniless and with little to his name but the letter of introduction from Benjamin Franklin. Franklin's letter of introduction would pay off for Paine, as Franklin's son-in-law helped Paine secure the job as editor of the Pennsylvania magazine. Paine was successful in growing the magazine's readership. Paine would also write articles and poetry. He wasn't afraid to write on politically divisive topics, including slavery. Paine was an abolitionist and wrote an article titled African Slavery in America, in which he denounced slavery. When Thomas Paine arrived in Philadelphia, the relationship between England and the American colonies was becoming more and more strained. Parliament and the Crown were becoming more tyrannical as the colonies were becoming more and more rebellious and freedom-minded. After Lexington and Concord, there was no turning back in the mind of Thomas Paine. In January 1776, Paine published Common Sense, an anonymous pamphlet that would become one of the most influential writings in American history. In Common Sense, Paine did not argue for reconciliation with England over the grievances of taxation without representation. No, Paine argued for American independence. Here are some quotes from Common Sense. Number 1. Government by kings was first introduced into the world by the heathens, from whom the children of Israel copied the custom. It was the most prosperous invention the devil ever set on foot for the promotion of idolatry. Quote number 2. As much hath been said of the advantages of reconciliation, which, like an agreeable dream, hath passed away and left us as we were, it is but right that we should examine the contrary side of the argument, and inquire into some of the many material injuries which these colonies sustain, and always will sustain, by being connected with and dependent on Great Britain. To examine that connection and dependence on the principles of nature and common sense, to see what we have to trust to if separated, and what we are to expect if dependent. Quote number 3. The authority of Great Britain over this continent is a form of government which, sooner or later, must have an end. Another powerful quote from Common Sense. Men of passive tempers look somewhat lightly over the offenses of Britain, and still hoping for the best are apt to call out, "Come, come, we shall be friends again for all of this." But examine the passions and feelings of mankind. Bring the doctrine of reconciliation to the touchstone of nature, and then tell me whether you can hereafter love, honor, and faithfully serve the power that hath carried fire and sword into your land? If you cannot do all these things, then are you only deceiving yourselves, and by your delay bringing ruin upon posterity. Your future connection with Britain, whom you can neither love nor honor, will be forced and unnatural, and being formed only on the plan of present convenience, will in a little time fall into a relapse more wretched than the first. But if you say you can still pass the violations over, then I ask, hath your house been burnt? Hath your property been destroyed before your face? Are your wife and children destitute of a bed to lie on, or bread to live on? Have you lost a parent or a child by their hands, and yourself the ruined and wretched survivor? If you have not, then you are not a judge of those who have. But if you have, and can still shake hands with the murderers, then you are unworthy the name of husband, father, friend, or lover, and whatever may be your rank or title in life, you have the heart of a coward and the spirit of a sycophant. And another final quote from Common Sense. As to government matters, it is not in the power of Britain to do this continent justice. The business of it will soon be too weighty and intricate to be managed with any tolerable degree of convenience by a power so distant from us, and so very ignorant of us. There was a time when it was proper, and there is a proper time for it to cease. Common Sense spread like wildfire throughout the colonies, selling hundreds of thousands of copies during the Revolution. It was passed around from person to person, family to family, town to town. It was read aloud at meetings and taverns. Common Sense was the spark that started the fire of revolution and inspired the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Paine was dedicated to the cause of American independence from his home country of England. He volunteered to serve as Nathaniel Greene's aide-de-camp during the very early stages of the war. He never stopped writing about the American cause. During the course of the war, he wrote 16 crisis pamphlets, but none were more important than the first. 1776 had been a difficult year, and by the early winter, it looked like this new country would not make it. The British had dealt blow after blow to George Washington and his army, pushing them out of New York and chasing them all over New Jersey. The American cause was nearly down for the count. Enlistments were running up at the end of the year. There was little doubt that the majority of Washington's army would refuse to re-enlist. It was at this time, on December 19, 1776, that Thomas Paine published The American Crisis No. 1. Again, Paine's words spread like wildfire. This is the introduction to The American Crisis. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of his country. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered, yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. What we obtain too cheap, we esteem too lightly. 'Tis dearness only that gives everything its value. Heaven knows how to put a proper price upon its goods, and it would be strange indeed if so celestial an article as freedom should not be highly rated. Britain, with an army to enforce her tyranny, has declared that she has a right not only to tax, but to bind us in all cases whatsoever. And if being bound in that manner is not slavery, then is there not such a thing as slavery upon earth? Even the expression is impious, for so unlimited a power can belong only to God. The American soldiers' determination and motivation was strengthened. They remembered what they were fighting for. General Washington had the American crisis read aloud to his troops on Christmas night before he and his troops crossed the Delaware River to attack the Hessians at Trenton the next morning. It was a rousing victory for the American cause. Trenton was a turning point for the Continental Army. Washington took advantage of the momentum and pressed on to Princeton, driving the British back into New York for the winter. It is uncertain that Washington would have even had an army in 1776 without the motivating words of Thomas Paine. In 1777, Congress would appoint Thomas Paine to the position of Secretary to the Committee for Foreign Affairs, a position he would not hold for very long. While Secretary, Paine continued writing his pamphlets. As Secretary, he was privy to confidential information. He discovered that Silas Deane, a member of Congress and diplomat to France, was unethically benefiting financially from his position. In order to publicly make his case against Deane in writing, he had to use confidential information only available to him as secretary. He was then denounced for the breach of confidentiality, and Deane's supporters rallied against Paine. Paine was forced to resign his post in 1779. Even though he had been forced to resign his post as secretary to the Committee for Foreign Affairs, Thomas Paine was still fervently dedicated to the cause of American freedom. After his resignation, Paine was appointed clerk to the Pennsylvania General Assembly. It was at this time that he realized the plight and frustration of the underpaid, ill-supplied, starving American soldier. The soldiers were at the end of their ropes as their grievances were continually going unaddressed. In response, Paine began raising money and donating his own money to help support the troops. In 1781, Thomas Paine and others went to France to petition the king for financial support. The mission was a success as they procured much-needed money, ammunition, and clothing. Paine's mission to France absolutely helped win the war. The wait is almost over. The History Revolution is proud to present our first homeschool history course, the Carolina Colony Before the Founding, where we focus on North and South Carolina history before the American Revolution. The Carolina Colony will be available January 20th. We are really excited for its release, and because we're so excited, we're making a special pre-sale offer to you. Between now and the course launch on January 20th, the Carolina Colony will be available for 25% off. You'll have access to an in-depth examination of the Carolina Colony, built-in quizzes, writing prompts, our worksheet library, as well as links to source material to continue your education. Click the link below to join the revolution. Thomas Paine's efforts in the fight for American independence were immeasurable. His writings had motivated the Declaration of Independence and American troops on the brink of giving up. Common Sense and the American Crisis had sold hundreds of thousands of copies, but Paine had little to show financially for his contributions. He refused to accept a profit for his writings because he wanted them to be cheap and available so they would spread and have more of an impact. In 1781, he asked George Washington for help. Washington then petitioned Congress to provide Paine with financial assistance due to his great service to the country. Paine had many enemies in Congress, though, and the effort was shot down. Washington also petitioned individual states. Only New York and Pennsylvania responded positively. Pennsylvania awarded Paine a small monetary gift, while New York gave him a 277-acre farm in New Rochelle. After the war, he would spend time on his farm and focus on inventions. In 1787, Thomas Paine left America for Europe in order to gather support and finances for his new iron bridge design. While in England, the French Revolution began. Paine full-heartedly supported the revolution. Edmund Burke's reflections on the revolution in France denounced the French Revolution, and in direct response to Burke, Paine wrote Rights of Man in support of the revolution. Again, Paine's words spread quickly throughout Europe and even in America. When Burke responded to Paine, Paine went on to write Rights of Man 2. Rights of Man 2 was much more than just a show of support for the French Revolution, though. No, it was a plan for a new form of government along with new political and economic systems. It was essentially as anti-monarchy as it could be. That didn't sit well with the aristocracy in England. The book was banned, the publisher was thrown in jail, and Paine was indicted for treason. Luckily for Paine, he had left the country on his way to France, where he had been elected to their National Convention. The National Convention was currently the ruling assembly of France. He was very popular in France, although he didn't speak very much French. He continued his political activism, supporting the revolution and ending the monarchy. However, he did not support killing the king and spoke out against it. King Louis XVI was convicted of treason and executed, and Paine was eventually imprisoned for almost a year once an even more radical sect took power. The radicals were overthrown and Paine was released from prison. While in prison, he wrote Age of Reason. He released Part 2 once he was released from prison. American ambassador to France, James Monroe, was helpful in getting Paine released from prison. In Age of Reason, he argued against Christianity and organized religion. He did believe in a creator, but not a creator that intervenes in the affairs of man. These are the beliefs of deism. God, Christianity, and morals are the difference between the American Revolution and the French Revolution. The American founding fathers set up a form of government through our Constitution that only works with a good and moral people. As John Adams wrote, our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. That is why the United States Constitution is the world's longest surviving written charter of government. The French seemingly get a new constitution every week. There have been 15 constitutions in France since the French Revolution. Paine seemed to be struggling to really find his true personal beliefs and moral compass. He was disillusioned with America and George Washington in particular. Paine felt that Washington had betrayed him by not helping him when he was imprisoned. Paine wrote a bitter, scathing, open letter to Washington where he accused Washington of being incompetent and corrupt. This did not help Paine's public persona in America, as Washington was very popular. In 1802, Thomas Paine decided to return to America at the request of President Thomas Jefferson. Paine was not a returning hero. His contributions to the American Revolution had been overshadowed by his more recent anti-religion writings and attacks on George Washington. His return to America happened during a religious revival known as the Second Great Awakening. Paine was in bad health and lived in obscurity until his death on June 8, 1809. He was buried on his farm in New Rochelle. However, he would not remain there. 10 years later, his body was exhumed by British journalist William Cobbett. Cobbett had been living in New York. His plan was to take Paine's remains back to his birth country of England so that Paine could be given the honorary funeral that Cobbett felt he deserved. For whatever reason, Cobbett never followed through and Paine's remains were lost. There is no doubt about the impact that Thomas Paine had on the world. His words inspired revolutions in America and France, but it seemed that he was never content and always aggrieved in some manner. He sought to build bridges, but many times he only burned them. His obituary that circulated in newspapers throughout the world said he had lived long, did some good, and much harm. Over time, the views on Paine have softened, and he is remembered and honored now for his many contributions, particularly to the American Revolution. Thank you again, friends, for watching and listening to the History Revolution podcast. Now, don't forget to go to the link in the description to join our newsletter. And especially don't forget about our new course, The Carolina Colony Before the Founding. The link for our limited time pre-sale is also in the description. God bless you all, and see you again next week.